Thanks, Sam. This is Jerod Moyer. And what I'd like to do first is have you turn open your materials to the table of contents. Lower right-hand corner of the page should be labeled A. And you can see the different sections we're going to go through. I want to draw your attention, though, to the bottom of the page. At the end of the materials that we're going to cover today, there's going to be several things that were published by the different regulatory agencies, whether it be the OCC or the agencies together, the FDIC, et cetera, that we're going to reference today. We're giving you those, the actual materials that were presented by the agencies at the end of our materials today. So we're going to give you all those references. We'll talk more about them as we go through today's presentation. The other thing that you'll find at the end of the materials, and it's the very last thing, is actually not frequently asked questions, but the questions from last year's webinar. And hopefully they'll help you out with some of the questions you may have in getting ready for this webinar or things that may come up along the way today, in addition to the ones you could submit during today's webinar. So just to kind of explain some of the materials. Let's go then to the first page of materials. And what I want to do is kind of set the table. The topic today is overdraft guidance and best practices. And normally what I would do is do key points at the end of the presentation and say, okay, here's what you should have gotten out of this presentation today. But what I want to do differently is I want to give them to you up front, because I want you to think about them and figure out how they intertwine with some of the concepts and the best practices that we're going to go through today. So I'm going to give you the key points up front. We'll give them to you again at the end, and hopefully you can kind of see how they're fitting together as we go through it. First off, overdrafts are still a hot button. They're not quite as hot a topic as they were 12 months ago. If you can remember back, or if you can think back to February 2012, about every other day for about a 2.5, 3-week period, there was some new headline with respect to overdrafts. Most of it was coming from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau or the FDIC. And we'll talk about what was going on a year ago as we go through today's presentation. But just because we haven't heard from them lately doesn't mean it's something that we can just put on the back burner. Aside from the mortgage stuff and the 3,500 pages of regulation that we got in the last 30 days, this is still there. There's still going to be something that comes out of it. But still a hot button is the point one. The CFPB's role, we're going to drill down and really get into the details of what they have going on here in the next couple of pages. But remember that they're there to protect the consumer. It's the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So some of the underlying points that kind of we've come up with that they're trying to drive home, really come up with like a list of 5, maybe 6 items. The first thing on their list of to-dos, if you will, is to make sure the customer is informed. That's one of the key points that I believe is intertwined in between or into all of the guidance, whether it be the CFPBs or guidance that came before the CFPB. So making sure the customer has all the information they need to make an informed decision. The second thing is to evaluate. And what I mean by the evaluate part of this is we shouldn't just blanket all consumers and say, okay, here you go, have this, and go forth. Each individual and their characteristics should dictate whether or not they get whatever it is that you're providing. And the example I'll give, and I'll get into more details later, is some of you have an automated program where maybe everybody gets, if they meet certain criteria, they automatically get this cushion. Well, maybe there's more criteria that needs to be looked at than just what you're trying to evaluate on. So maybe we need to expand the evaluation. It should be on a case-by-case basis, and I'll provide more insight later on. Providing options. Your overdraft, whatever overdraft protection program you're talking to them about, well, that might not be the best one for them. Maybe it's a credit card, maybe it's a sweep account, maybe it's a loan, or whatever the other options are. But to provide, again, the customer with options so that they can, again, make that best decision based on all the information in front of them. The next one is to set limits. What I wrote in my book is don't let the meter run. If they've overdrawn their account, yes, charge them a fee, whatever, within the confines of the regulations and guidance. But don't just sit and let the meter run and the daily overdraft fees. Not that you can't have them, but there's a point in time which, we need to stop the bleeding so that they can do something to get themselves back to normal. And so one of the things that we've heard is don't let the meter run. And that's the set limits, have guidelines. The fifth one is to monitor and manage. This is a big one. You can't just say, oh, we have a program, it's taking care of itself, we don't even watch it. You've got to have a way to watch it, whether it be reports or whatever, with respect to the parameters given to us in the guidance, and we'll go through them later on and explain what those are. But then when you have those reports, what do you do with them? What decisions do you make based on the results that are provided to you? So kind of my top 5 for the CFB, I'll give them to you one more time, is inform, evaluate, options, limits, and then the last one's kind of a combo. It's monitor and manage, and those two kind of go together. And the one I'll leave you with here is, and we'll talk more about it later, is some of you may be on the call going, well, I don't have an automated program, or I don't have an overdraft program. Well, I bet you do. Maybe it's ad hoc, meaning that it's a discretionary decision that an officer makes on a daily basis. Automated programs are primarily the focus of a lot of the stuff we're going to go through today, but there are some things that do apply to the banks that have discretionary decisions, or the ad hoc banks. And I think while there's some things that wouldn't apply, most of the concepts do. Maybe not to the same degree, but they do apply. And I'll give you some more insight on that a little bit later. So at the end of the day, hopefully those are the key points that you're able to take away from this. So wanted to set the table there and have you think about those things as we work through the materials today. Well, let me give you an overview of where all this is coming from, and that's what's on page 1. It says at the top basically that the agencies are expecting banks to adhere and evaluate the guidance that's been presented before them. Now, obviously, it depends on who your regulator is and which piece of guidance we're talking about, but a lot of the principles are the same between the different guidance. And you might say, well, the OCC didn't say this. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not a good best practice, or that it's not something that you shouldn't evaluate. It's just they didn't come out and say it. So just because their name or your regulator's name is not on whatever piece of best practice we're talking about today, doesn't mean you should just throw it to the side either. The first piece of guidance that came out, letter A on your book there, is one that was rubber stamped by all the agencies way back in 2005. And this guidance wasn't something that specifically targeted automated programs. It targeted all types of overdraft protection programs, whether it be a line of credit, whether it be an automated program or an ad hoc program. All the agencies kind of got together and rubber stamped this thing and said, okay, banks, go forth and conquer within these guidelines. And if we've been in your bank, what we've been explaining for banks to do for the last 7-8 years is take that guidance, and you don't necessarily have to follow it all to the letter, but at least address it. We are or aren't going to do this, and here's why. Or we'll look to this in the future. We'll reevaluate it down the road. But don't just throw it by the wayside and say, oh, it doesn't apply to me. Because there are some principles in there that I think do apply to all banks and that should be considered. So that was the first one that came out. Then we have letter B, the FDIC, and this is really the game changer. Back in 2010, they published guidance for their banks with respect to overdraft practices. Now, this is in addition to the 2005 guidance. And what was weird about this, or different about it, is first off, it's guidance, but it had a mandatory effective date. And the effective date, I believe, was sometime in July of 11. We'll break that down more later. But they came out and said, okay, evaluate this, put together a plan, and then, by the way, you'd have to have it implemented by July 2011. Well, as July 2011 approached us, a lot of banks were going, what? And we got to do this, huh? What do you mean by this? So they came out with letter C, the answers to frequently asked questions 3 months before this thing was supposed to go into effect. And again, it raised the stakes, if you will. It was a game changer. And about that same time that those FAQs, or just after those FAQs came out, well, the OCC said, gosh, we're sitting here and we haven't done anything. We better do something about this. We've got some of the biggest banks in the country. So they kicked out a proposal. Again, another thing that was a little bit different. When was the last time, other than flood insurance, you saw a proposal for guidance? And so they introduced this proposal, and it pretty much lined up with the FDIC. Not exactly, but a lot of the things were the same. What's interesting about that is that guidance is still proposed. It was never finalized. Now, my hunch is it wasn't finalized because we now have the CFPB that has jumped in, and they're going to, I'll talk more about that in a minute, but they're going to change things a little bit. So